divestment movements across the world right now are focusing on. So I'm just going to show this really brief video to give an overview of what divestment is and why it's important, and then go into more of what divestment things are happening at Truman right now. This is not. Why should I squash that one?
There's this campaign going on mainly in the US at the moment, and it's a new way into the whole climate debate that is a bit different from, change your light bulbs.
Divestment is a very simple idea. You just take the money away from companies that are involved in extracting fossil fuel.
You want your money to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Divestment is the biggest signal which any individual or company can give to the fossil fuel industry.
If you want to do something about climate change, you want those fossil fuel companies to stop burning the reserves they've got, and you want them to behave differently. You do that by refusing to buy their shares.
Divestment says we do not accept your premise, we do not like what you're doing.
And in practical terms, it's about moving your money away from the problem and towards the solution.
I don't know about you, but I don't really have any shares. But we all have stakes in pension funds and various forms of investment through our lives. And those investments will almost certainly include shares in fossil fuel companies.
A generation ago, when the biggest moral issue in the world was apartheid in South Africa, Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu suggested this tactic, that it was time for the great institutions of the West to cut their economic ties with companies that propped up the apartheid regime. If there's ever going to be any kind of international agreement, it'll only be because our political and business leaders are feeling unrelenting pressure from all over the world.
So unless there's political pressure to change, nothing will change.
Divestment is very useful for shaming companies, it's very useful for bringing the issue out into the open more.
It provides a really powerful moral framework.
This is not a normal movement. There are no great leaders. There's no Dr. King of the climate movement. The fossil fuel industry is sprawling. It's protean. And so the resistance to it needs to be the same way.
But that's the exciting part. The change isn't a technological change, it's not scientific change, it is now social change.
We should be tackling fossil fuel companies directly. Leave it
In the ground.
on the ground.
So that's from the Keep It in the Ground movement. So that kind of gives an overview of what divestment is. There's been a divestment movement going on mainly at universities and other institutions and churches throughout the country and throughout the world for the past several years. And last year at the People's Climate March, no, I guess it was 2014, I went to that in New York City, and that was a huge focus at the Climate March, and also Emily and I have been to a few environmental retreats and conferences and things, and there's always students that are talking about divestment and how they're doing it and their struggles and their successes. In the state of Missouri, Mizzou has a Beyond Coal movement that's been going on for a few years. Missouri State tried to do a divestment movement, and then when they got to the point that we're kind of at right now at Truman, they kind of were like, this is going to be too difficult, and they stopped. And then Washington University in St. Louis had a huge divestment movement that kind of peaked last year because WashU has many more millions of dollars invested in fossil fuels than Truman does, and they have ties with Peabody Coal. So I can send out an article about that because that's super interesting and inspiring what the students at WashU did. But I wanted to focus on Truman, so I'm just going to kind of give an overview of what's been done so far. I've been involved with ECO, the Environmental Campus Organization, and about this time last year is when we started talking about divestment. We met with Mark Gambiana, who was the head of the vice president of the Divestment office, I believe, and I had a couple meetings with him to talk about the possibility of divesting from fossil fuels. And then I wrote with two other students, Becca Elder and Caitlin Meyer, a letter to the investment committee last March, basically saying that there have been movements all over the country. It was right after February of 2014, where there's like a global divestment day, and a lot of students across the country had a heat week, so they really put like extreme pressure on their universities that week and had a lot of protests on their campuses, and there were over 400 events in 48 countries. So I wrote about that, and also just like the gap between what Truman says it's doing for the environment and what's actually being done. Because if you look on Truman's website, it has a lot of sustainability goals, like we're putting in some solar panels and we're getting water bottle fill stations, yet we have like $475,000 invested in fossil fuel companies, which compared to some bigger universities, that's like pocket change. We have $42 million invested total with the investment committees fund, and like $500,000 of that, like I said, are in fossil fuel companies. So basically saying that like Truman has sustainability goals, and it was really nice. I thought we were like really trying to work with them, and kind of like what Caitlin was talking about earlier. We wanted to start by like trying to have a civil conversation with them and everything. So I can pass that around if you want to look at it. It's basically just elaborating on everything I just said. But so we found out that we have that much money invested in a few fossil fuel companies. You might have seen in the background in this video when oil was dripping down really nicely. Ameretta Hess, Apache, British Petroleum or BP, Conoco, and Total are the 5 companies we have invested in. And I have a Google Doc with a few other people from ECO where we're researching all of these companies and basically why they're terrible. We went to a investment committee meeting last October, so a few months back, and we were really excited because a lot of students who are doing divestment campaigns at their universities don't get that opportunity, but since Truman is smaller and it's not like Harvard or anything, we were invited to go to that meeting. And then we got there and we were really upset, and I ended up getting pretty fiery because they were basically acting like we didn't know what we were talking about, and they were drilling us about like, why are we doing this? Like, what alternatives do we have? Like, what other universities have successfully done this, and how do they do it? Like, very specific questions and things. And I was basically like, this is a moral issue, and you're the ones making the investment. So we're just saying, like, you should probably stop. And, like, I didn't threaten them or anything, I would say. We tried to be really nice, but it was really frustrating because they really, like, turned it on us and made it, like, our fault. They were like, well, why don't you get involved with other things on campus to be environmentally involved? Like, why are you focusing on us when you could be doing things in your own life? And we were like, okay. So that was interesting. And afterwards, Beckett, Caitlin, and I were just like, well, we're really interested to see how, like, they respond to us. And they just got back earlier in the week. But what they asked us to do when we left was by their next investment meeting, which is, I think, in April sometime, they wanted us to have alternatives that they could invest in. Also, like, why these companies are bad, because one woman in particular was saying, like, you know, BP is doing good things now, like, after the oil spill, and, like, these companies are recognizing that they need to transition fuels. And so we were like, okay, so we started this Google Doc and everything. And then it's really great that I'm doing this week because we received on Monday a letter back because Mark Gambiano retired from Truman, and so I was in contact this semester asking who was our new contact. They gave us a new contact, and then he was like, oh yeah, and they wrote you this letter. So I'll just like skim through it briefly. It says, to the concerned students of ECO, thank you for attending our recent investment committee meeting and raising your concern about the divestment within the fossil fuel industry of the Truman State University Foundation portfolio. The points raised were into consideration and research. While we continue to monitor low carbon and more broadly environmental and social governance ESG issues involved with investing at this time, it would be difficult to divest effectively from individual companies associated with fossil fuels. Our main responsibility to the donors is to maximize the portfolio return for a given level of risk based on accepted investment practices and not make political, societal, or other qualitative judgments. Given the diversity of the Foundation's private donors, we institute guidelines within our investment policy statement based on widely accepted and established investment principles. We allow the advisors and managers who select the investments to do so within those well-accepted parameters and without discrimination against companies based on their qualitative criteria. We do this so that our advisors and money managers can invest in opportunities that maximize benefit to the Foundation and the students it supports. Then they said, with your concerns in mind, we do encourage individual donors and institutions interested in being more environmentally sustainable to establish funds for campus programs that matter to them. They said, thank you for your concern and demonstrating your passion for environmental causes. We will continue to monitor and evaluate data of the ESG investment strategies and the topic as a whole as the academic literature grows. So I was just like, okay. And I kind of think, you saw my Facebook post the other day, I kind of think they expect us to stop. I think, honestly, that made a difference that we were 3 young women who were going to them, and we dressed really nice, and we tried to be really respectful to them, and I think they kind of wrote us off, which is really frustrating. So before I want to open the conversation to what you all think could be next steps to escalate action, because at ECO on Monday, everyone agreed that we should continue with this and not throw in the towel quite yet. So I just wanted to point to some human rights things that are associated with fossil fuels as well, and these companies in particular that Truman is invested in. So Amerada Hess, I hadn't heard of before, but they're invested in a shale formation in North Dakota, which is, I'm almost positive, on indigenous lands, because basically all the fracking for shale gas that is done in North Dakota is on indigenous people's lands. So that's a concern. Also, they have some in Ohio. Then Apache, which is named ironically, they have had multiple accidents. One major one was in June of 2013, and 60,000 barrels of toxic waste was spilled in Alberta, Canada, which is again on native lands. So a lot of these companies affect native peoples in particular in the northern U.S. and in Canada. And then BP, of course, most of you know about the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010 and how that leaked for 87 days in the Gulf of Mexico, and that is still not repaired. I mean, they're still seeing the effects of that 6 years later, and I think it's going to continue for many decades into the future. And that being said, accidents happen, but they did not follow basic safety practices in that instance whatsoever. And they also have on their website that they are, we believe that the best way for BP to achieve sustainable success as a company is to act in the long-term interests of our shareholders, our partners, and society. We strive to be a world-class operator, a responsible corporate citizen, and a good employer. So basically all of their website was just total bull crap. And also, they're not the only ones on their websites who are saying, yes, we acknowledge climate change, but we believe that it can be solved using, business practices. And by that they mean, investing more in, shale gas, fracking, which you may have heard about, is horrible. France has banned fracking, I believe, and New York State has banned fracking. So obviously there's some problems with it. It poisons water, So they also have new investments in Alberta on indigenous land. So, those are 3 of them. We haven't looked as much into Conoco in total yet, but I'm sure they're just as bad. That's kind of what we've done so far with the divestment movement. We also met with the Bulldog Student Investment Fund last semester because the investment committee recommended, that's smaller, and they're dealing with $50,000 instead of $42 million. So you should go to them and see what they can recommend. And they also thought it was ridiculous that they were having us come up with the alternative investments because they know we're not econ students or anything. We're environmental studies majors, and we were presenting a more moral argument. So if anybody has a background in investment, if we need to offer them alternative options, the only thing is that the Bulldog Student Investment Fund and the investment committee said that renewable energies wouldn't be a good alternative because they're not profitable enough yet. So I thought that was interesting because a lot of fossil fuel companies are going bankrupt. So that didn't really make any sense to me. That being said, fossil fuels aren't the only thing that we could divest from. I know SDS chapters are doing divestment from private prisons and defense and armaments and things. So those are other topics you can take into consideration. Becca mentioned at ECO on Monday because I had said those are other things that we could bring up to the investment committee while we're at it. She said that she thought that might be like too much, and that might make it less likely that we would win anything. But I don't know how like everyone else feels about that, because I was kind of like, we should go for it. Like, but I don't know. What does anybody else think?
I think if you're bringing things up that are immoral, then it would be good to bring up more things that are immoral, because like it doesn't. I mean, the argument's going to be the same for all of those, that we shouldn't be supporting them if we're talking about like supporting democratic institutions, and like that doesn't really go along with that at all. Like what Truman supposed to support.
And we didn't ask about that, but I think if we could get another meeting with them, we could find out like what investments we have in those sorts of companies. Yeah.
I would say one of the best things first is, when does the investment committee have a meeting next?
They have one once a semester, and I believe the spring one is in April sometime.
If we could get a lot of people to go, that
Yeah.
would be very.
That was on my
that would
list.
send a much different message, and we as a campus should be, or excuse me, we as a group should be telling students about this, because I can
Yeah.
tell you most students have absolutely no idea. First of all, that Truman has a lot of money to invest. They don't understand that, nor what we put it into.
Yeah.
So I think if we were to educate, especially our left-wing friends, we could get a president to go there and say this is not acceptable.
Right. And one thing I was thinking of is doing like a petition and trying to get as many
Yes.
signatures as possible too, and having people at the next investment committee meeting like outside, like with signs, like protesting in Violet, which is where the meeting was last time, and like delivering that petition to them. And it'd be great if we could get like a group to be able to go to the actual meeting as well and
Exactly.
have that presence.
Kind of dealing with your previous question as well of like if we should bring up other issues. I think because of their response to your last inquiry, where they were saying we don't want to judge based on qualitative like parts of the company or like facets of the company. If you bring it up less as like a restatement of we need to move away from fossil fuel, we need to move away from private president, and more just the argument that yes, we should base largely on qualitative like reasons. Like I think it would be, number one, pretty easy to get people to sign a petition for that, and number two, it would be easier than just restating to them and hoping for different things.
That's
What is fracking? I'm sorry, I should
Um,
ask this question.
Yeah, hydraulic fracturing, it's like, I could bring up a graph on here, but it's like drilling into the earth, like this way, and then it's like cracking. Okay, it's very hard to explain, but it's extracting, a way to extract natural gas that is fairly new. We do it in shale formations around the country. The main issue, here's a picture of it. The main issue with fracking is that, I think, is that it completely like poisons water. You use like millions of gallons of water for one fracking well, and you have to mix like thousands of chemicals in there, and you like shoot it underground, and you can never get that water back. And I think it's what it's silly to be doing when we're having droughts all over the world. But yeah, it's a mix of water, sand, and chemicals pumped into a well. It cracks like underneath the ground, like I was saying, and it's also been linked to a lot of earthquakes in places like Oklahoma and Texas. I think there's an undeniable connection between those two things, because you're cracking earth under the ground and inserting billions or millions of gallons of water under the soil. And yeah, a potential risk is groundwater contamination, air quality degradation. I went to West Virginia 2 years ago for an activism camp, and we visited a fracking site and like the homes around it, and people can light their like faucet water on fire.
That's a real thing.
Yeah, like you can
Because
find
in the documentary they said that
Gasland.
They were saying that it was a hoax, the thing, but it's totally not.
It's definitely not.
Ugh.
So it poisons water. It's said by a lot of people to be a transition fuel from like coal to renewable energies, but it's just as bad, I think. And people say it has a lower carbon emissions, but it has higher methane emissions, and methane is a more intense greenhouse gas than carbon.
You mean the natural gas does?
Yeah.
I just think like for like pragmatic purposes, even at SDS, if we were to, we need to talk to a quote on a bigger organization that will let you present. Giving, like for instance, if we could have, you talk to the college attendance, there's a way that we can partner with someone to get you to your presentation violent, to get people, first of all, we make a Facebook event to educate people, have Chloe and Nico talk, have a position there that will be more effective than just us going around and telling people. Because a lot of people will just write us off as the crazy leftist liberals, and we need to have an actual conversation where you show them what's happening. A real presentation. This wasn't real, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like something, yeah.
Open forum would be good. We could also have, especially when the Progressive Leftist Coalition, whatever they're calling it, gets formed, with the Democrats, Amnesty, there'd be other, AMSA might be interested. Yeah.
Because some of them will be willing to go with you, probably like, I would love to go.
Also,
in my mind. Piece of my mind, but
Earth people were super interested in this as well, and they've got money. So
Yeah.
Earth, what do you mean, Earth Week people?
yes,
Like we could, even if you could do it during Earth Week, or
Yeah.
find out when their date is, and we need to do something before then,
Okay.
and have you present, because that was wonderful.
Earth Week is the week before that meeting, I think. Do you know exactly what day? Because if it's at the end of
No.
April.
I don't know the day. I asked, but they didn't give me a response.
And are we allowed? Is it a closed meeting, or they have to invite us to go?
We were invited because we requested to be invited, but I feel like we could get another invitation, like if we
And
could
if
keep
not, I
going.
would say it's got to be. I mean, this is
What
Yeah.
meeting are you talking about?
The
Yeah,
meeting
yeah.
with the investment committee.
Oh, okay.
Um,
I know when that date is, and we can start.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask is that the letter I read to you all from the investment committee to concerned students, I need to respond to that, and I'd like to do it tonight or tomorrow. What do you all think I should say? Because I was basically going to say thank you for your time in responding, but we plan on escalating action basically and doing the following.
Well, I think you should be a bit impertinent about the old hat argument they give about it's not economic to consider these things, it's bad for our investors. Whether we like it or not, fracking has now gone so far in this country that actually it's being used as an argument by capitalists and the establishment economists to downgrade oil because the United States is about to become self-sufficient due to the menace and the evil of fracking. Now, I think the environmental cost and damage to indigenous people is something that a liberal arts university should be reminded is a pay deficit as well as a social evil, and there's no guarantee once fracking finishes it's for good. It tears up the environment. That's been the big protest of the British anti-fracking movement in Sussex and the Green Belt, which our right-wing government has just given the American oil fracking companies the excuse to do. So, and the other thing is on the economic argument, now's the time to actually hit them locally on a matter of unpopularity. Nearly all the companies you mention are very unpopular locally, and they're in particular because of something you've denounced in your own index articles, and that is the pipeline. It's damaging property values, it's despoiling small property values. Betty's vote consisted of a lot of people who want to protest that, and therein is wrecking and damaging people economically, and Truman shouldn't be involved in that because it is actually destroying small business, making it impossible for Truman to get workers for Zydeco and others because they can't afford to live here anymore because Amerin is charging a fortune, charging all of us for this. So I think you should give them a little bit of an impertinent argument against their idea that all this is economically viable, and that say that in the long term they are damaging their investment portfolio because they are investing in unpopular and destructive things, economically speaking, even by capitalist language. So put that in more decent terms and take it head on. And the other thing is, I do think, I can see how it's very wisely of Chloe and speakers around and forums and to have demonstrations, but you can only do so much that way, and it very much depends on getting the media, the TV media, to come around and film a demonstration and give you a little bit of soundbite to actually talk to a larger audience. But when it comes to BP, Apache, and so on, there's surely more can be done in letters to the editor and articles just to identify to ordinary students who do not understand what BP does. For example, the American despolation they did was based on what they had been doing previously in Nigeria, to the basin peoples there. I know because I taught the daughter, one of the daughters of Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was the protest leader and was executed by the Nigerian dictatorship for exposing what Shell and BP were up there, Zia. So I think there's some more basic education that can be done by just telling students and local people what these companies' records really is. And you don't even have to mention that in your reply to these other people, Chloe. And one bit of hope, I think you mentioned Apache is very much involved with an Alberta tar sands exploitation and of indigenous people. Well, something rather funny happened there. The 50 years of right-wing control of the province of Alberta, making it the most reactionary and equivalent of Texas in terms of bad politics, ended last spring when, of all things, the Socialist Party, a mild Socialist Party, the NDP, took control for the first time in Alberta's history. Now, they have a problem. The oil industry is going bankrupt in Alberta because of the Saudis keeping the prices too high, and many people, as in the Dakotas, as in Texas, are being laid off. So they're not exactly well disposed, these companies. But the NDP, predominantly feminist ministers, are sympathetic to reconciling their environmental prospects with the fact that they now have power. And they might be able to suggest to you campaigning techniques and what they can do, not as much as you and I would like. And it might be worthwhile looking up who are the responsible ministers on the websites there and inviting some of them down. Because Rachel Notley, the female leader, she's the first NDP premier to be a female leader, is very interested in coming and talking to political science groups, saying, there are some places besides Saskatchewan and others that elect socialist governments in North America, and we do try and reconcile our environmental commitments with our need to keep jobs and provide jobs. It might be worthwhile getting faculty, even respectable faculty, to use some of their grants each year to invite some of herself or some ministers down to talk about what they are doing. It may not be satisfactory, but it will start to educate people, and even Mr. Gambacino's equivalent and so on will have to be nice to visitors like that. And they have been in the past when Betty and I, through Amnesty International, occasionally got some Canadian, and Mark sometimes gets some Central American speakers and South American speakers to classes and things like that. So I think there's more can be done on education other than you having to speak all the time.
I was going to ask something just for your, or interject with your response to the committee. I would maybe bring up the fact that you guys aren't the only ones who think this.
Yeah.
That there are other students that agree, and we take this issue seriously. That it's not something we're just, we think you should take the money, that we actually care about it.
Can I use SDS's name?
Yes, I think so. There's nothing against that in the Constitution.
The fact that it's more than just you.
Yeah,
it's more than just
right.
ego. But the other thing you might want to look to do is there a list of the investors at Truman? Because if we can personally contact them, they are the people who are getting these portfolios to be filled. So if we can write them letters and they can, surely there has to be some good liberal on there.
Yeah, I feel like there's a list somewhere. I was on a divestment call with universities across the country last year, but I soon found out that most of them were like Harvard and Yale and like UCLA, and I was like, I'm Truman. We're very different than all of you, because they had like millions and millions invested in stuff, and they had donors of like hundreds of thousands of dollars. But what they did is they got the list of the donors, and they contacted the donors and said, our university is invested in these fossil fuel companies for this many millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we are proposing that you donate to our fund until they divest from fossil fuels. So then this group had the fund, and they wouldn't give that money to the university until the university divested from fossil fuels. If that makes any sense. So, but I don't know how, if that information is public. I feel like it should be.
I feel like it should be.
Yeah.
How did you originally conduct the research and provide $475,000?
That's the number they gave us. Yeah, so they told us. Is the website?
Is there a website for them?
Is there any way for us to review more investments?
I feel like there should be. I feel like it should be public information, but when we ask them, we ask specifically at the meeting, like, how much money is invested in fossil fuel companies and what are those companies' names? The main guy who had the portfolio looked around the room and he's like, can I tell them that information? And so I feel like they mean it to be confidential, even though we're a public university, that should be public knowledge.
Well, one thing you have to watch, and I think it's of concern to everybody here, is the growing influence of something called Truman Foundation. Now, I don't know whether Mark knows more about it than I do, but this was supposed to be for alumni funds originally, a body in which all the alumni could show their wealth and their interest in Truman. But it's increasingly been taking over large parts of this campus, and because it is a private foundation operating within a public university, they often claim confidentiality, business confidentiality. And if you're finding that they're not telling you because they claim it's really a matter of investments which are now shared or are mainly with the Truman Foundation, then be very concerned and expose it as best as you can. But unfortunately, the more this university puts money in, and the more the alumni extend under Professor Kevin Finch, their influence, Lynch, I think is his name, actually, their influence, they're already big in Truman media publications which run the index and things like that, the more you're going to find confidentiality used against your request. This is something which you can make an issue with the community because it is a taxpayer still essentially funded and is a student fee public university. This is where you have a stronger moral and accountability and taxpayer economic argument than students at Washington University where I have taught, because they officially can hide behind confidentiality because while their investments are vast, they're private. Truman, trying to hide things in the Truman Foundation is a very questionable practice and might one day be legally challengeable. But certainly it should be made an issue, and I think that's maybe why you might be getting looks, can I tell her this? Are they entitled to this? Because they are really thinking, well, what is the Truman Foundation going to think of this? But you've got to watch, the more money Truman puts into Truman Foundation, the more it is semi-privatized and made less accountable on things like investment.
Who did you go through originally to contact and set up this meeting?
Yeah, we went to Mark Gambiana. He was the head of one of the heads of the advancement office. He retired, and he was like pretty nice to work with. And he just was the liaison between us and the investment committee. And then he was the one who was told them about what we were trying to do. And then he invited us to the meeting. And he sat in on the meeting, but he didn't seem like a strong voice at it. But now the main contact, I guess, I think his name is Charles Hunsaker. I don't really know his position, but that's who we were directed to talk to. And he's the one who forwarded me this letter from the investment committee to Becca, Caitlin, and I.
Out of the amount of money they're investing in these companies, where is this money coming from? Is this partially tuition or in taxpayer money as well? Like you were saying?
The money that, the $42 million that the place or the committee has, I think it seems like a lot of it is from donors, because that's what.
Now, who are they donating it to? Are they donating it to the foundation, as I suspect?
Oh, okay. So they're what they said to us, which is I can totally understand, is that they want to make secure investments because they use some of that money from that they have in their fund to fund scholarships for students. Which is understandable, but also, I was like, well, also you're investing in climate change, and that's not good for our future either. And yeah, so.
There's also a student representative to the board that we could probably get in contact with.
Do you know?
Stephanie Fox, I looked up online.
Okay.
Truman State University Foundation Board of Directors. She's listed there, but we can try to do something.
Also, where is the economic gain that they receive from investing in these organizations? What do they initially gain? You were saying scholarship money, that is something that they get from that. What else are they getting? Because I feel like they're looking at it more as a loss. So as he's presenting it, you're losing more by investing, in a sense.
I wonder how much, in other words, it's a percentage that goes to scholarships, and get them to name scholarships That would be of some benefit at least, but I suspect, like the other question just now, that a lot of that doesn't go to scholarships, and a lot of it, when they use bullshit language about secure investments, is replowing the money back into these companies by buying shares and stocks in these companies and living off the fact to avoid taxpayer and student fee accountability and thing on. If it's can find out more breakout information and use the fact that they can't all hide behind the Truman Foundation, private foundation running a public university, the better.
Yeah, I'm not sure where. Besides that's the only thing they brought up was that some of it goes to.
But what do they mean by some?
Right.
Yeah, in other cases, that's been more of like an ideological justification. Harvard has like the largest investment fund of any university, and like very, very little of it actually goes to scholarships. It's basically just like a huge sum of money that is like constantly expanding itself and not really doing anything other than making money.
Yeah.
Which I wouldn't be surprised if that was Truman too.
Right. There's no way all 42 million goes to these scholarships. I wish.
That's like our entire budget every year.
Okay. Well, I'll send them. I'll copy the SDS email account on the email I send them today or tomorrow. Anything else? Or do we want to like touch base on this like weekly, ideally? So that
Well, they're asking you for alternatives, right? Alternative energy things, which they claim. They actually said, if I remember your quotation or if I looked at it, they're not economically viable. Oh no, the electric car is more viable now. The thing that has never been properly invested in, as Rob Nader has long pointed out, because of the oil situation and the fact that there's no price differential now. The oil-run fossil fuel cars are as cheap as it would cost for them to be mandated by government intervention and things like that to start investing in the electric car and things like that if we must have the car. Mass transit is more viable than ever, particularly in areas and cities like this where there is an aging demographic population which cannot afford and is sometimes a hazard on the road with private cars. This whole argument about economic unsustainability couldn't be more challengeable than now at the moment. And just a hint of that, in terms of people thinking of long-term, secure social investments, is, I think, worth working on.
Could you also send us the contact info for that guy before the email from the board and everything?
Or you just like put it in the Google Doc. We could have like a section for it or whatever. Another thought on this: if the meeting is during Earth Week, currently we're on the Earth Week committee, but we don't really have anything to offer other than like I guess like foot soldiers for all the other activities that are going on. So if this investment meeting happens to be during Earth Week, then we could theoretically mobilize a whole bunch of students who are on Earth Week because Chris wanted us to do some kind of activism thing. And if we're not going at Sodexo, like because they're not cool with that, then I think this would be a very realistic thing to do, and it would be extremely successful just like because the number of people that would probably end up hearing about it at least. So we should probably find out when the day of that meeting is. I couldn't find it on the internet. It's kind of hidden.
Yeah.
LOL.
The other thing I'm going to try to do here while we wrap up the meeting is find out what students are on the student one. What's that called? Yeah. And see if any of them seem like they may be sympathetic and get their help to find alternatives because they're the ones who will know that.
One of them lives on my floor, so I could talk to him about it. Shane Lagur or something or other that's long. It starts with an L. Like Lagrasse or I don't know.
I know one of the girls too, she's graduating, so we can at least try to fill those people out and they can help us find alternatives.
Thank you all.
Thanks for presenting.